There you go. Thank you, Eli. Boy, I made you co-host and all of a sudden I lost all my power here.
Well, I think we should go ahead and get started.
Well,
Well,
hang on one sec. We've got a bunch just queuing in. If you don't mind, it's 7:01. If you could wait till 7:02, would that be acceptable?
No problem.
Okay, I think that's the start time, Eli.
welcome everybody to the April edition of RAC Seminar Series. I'm Eli Fishpaw, facilitator for this series in 2022. Mark Cohen will present his experience creating and deploying biochar. I'm going to let Mark describe what this is and the benefits it can provide for mitigating climate. I met Mark last year when I attended a biochar workshop sponsored by the Virginia Biological Association. What I really appreciated about this event was that the participants and the presenters saw hopeful empowerment in new tools. Mark has a background in wildlife biology, ecology, permaculture, cooperative land use, and renewable energy. He has been an organic inspector with the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association for 30 years, and he has been living off the national grid for 42 years. He founded the Belize Agroforestry Research Center, a permaculture research and teaching facility based in Southern Belize, and spent 25 winters in Central America practicing and teaching tropical permaculture. Mark is constantly learning, teaching, and inventing, and consulting in his travels. RAC is sponsoring this seminar for the potential of building ecological resilience. RAC is not endorsing biochar. We do not know what Mark will share until we hear his talk. Speaking for myself, I am inspired by the potential of biochar. I personally engage in production and use of biochar at a novice scale. Biochar fits into a wider palette of choices for building ecological resilience. I asked Mark to focus primarily on biochar as a method for increasing carbon in the ground and increasing the sponge capacity of our soils, having a cooling impact on our local climate. Mark will present to us for about 60 minutes. The chat is available for clarifying questions regarding the content. Barbara Walsh will monitor the chat to bring forward those questions during the presentation. We ask that you hold questions and comments that lead to a wider discussion until the end of the presentation. Welcome, Mark, to our community. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Eli. Appreciate everybody coming in and looking at this picture for a little bit tonight. I think normally this piece that I'm going to be talking about tonight is embedded in a much larger conversation about conservation in general and the relationship that human economic systems and social systems and agricultural systems have in the world. I'll leave this slide up for a little bit just because I think it gives a bit of a background of the territory that I find myself in quite a bit. This has an agricultural bent to it. I came into agriculture indirectly. I started off in wildlife biology and I began looking very deeply at wildlife habitat and the quality of habitat, the health of the organisms that I was studying, and what you can do to manage those habitats to raise the capacity of life within them. That was the piece that really drew me in. And eventually I realized that one of the top threats to all of the species that I was managing and studying was human interfaces with, among other things, agriculture. So I began growing more and more of my own food and got into agriculture because it was an existential threat to the biological systems that I was managing. 40 some years later, I'm still pretty deep into it. And along the way, I found that I really needed to see some cultures that were not so removed from these ecological systems and had a far higher percentage of people who were participating in their food supply. And also to see the ecosystems that at that time I was dazzled by, because in the tropical rainforest, there's so much that you can see. What I didn't realize back then was the amount of biodiversity that was under my feet in the soil my whole life. And it took me a lot longer to come to terms with that. But one of the things that I found along the way was that in the tropical forest, the soils are very thin and the organic matter oxidizes about as fast as you can generate it. And so that became a major design piece, which I came to understand that the ecology of the tropical forest, and I'll bring this back around to us up here, but the ecology of the tropical forest is largely that a lot of the nutrient cycling that happens in the soil in the temperate zones is actually happening in the botanical multi-layered canopy systems. And so I was mimicking that, growing about 150 species of crops with chocolate and coffee and ginger and avocados and turmeric and all those kinds of species, with a 20-year rotation of Mayan crops that went into that. Now that's a whole conversation in itself, but the point I'm moving toward is that this difficulty of keeping carbon around, right? So that's like the backdrop to this biochar piece, which kind of takes us into looking at carbon, and I have a very different view than a lot of what is being discussed in the climate story, which is almost 100% focused on fossil fuels being the problem. And I'm not saying they're not a problem. I've lived off the grid and I have many systems of getting away from it myself, but I don't believe that that is as central to the problem as it's being talked about. It's really more of where that carbon in the atmosphere came from and where it's not participating in the soil, the forest, the multitudes of ecological cycles and relationships that have been oxidized and put into the atmosphere. These were living beings that were doing critical hydrological functions for our biosphere. And humans have made about 25% of the land mass into man-made deserts in the last 6,000 to 8,000 years. And that's a very good place to begin to restore these systems back to ecological health. So let me bump forward just a minute, and I don't want to spend much time on this about carbon, but the main thing I want to point out in this slide is this large number in the soil, 2,300 gigatons of carbon compared to 800 in the atmosphere. And then also the flux that's coming down from photosynthesis of about 120, and the 60 and 60, and the roughly 9 from fossil fuels, which is netting us about 10 gigatons beyond what is being drawn down. So that's what's causing problems in a few different ways. But like I mentioned, the issue is really that we've compromised the ability of the photosynthesis to draw down. So we've got a big opportunity to raise this photosynthetic number here, and also to decrease the decomposition, which includes burning. Now, I'll get into the complexity of burning, because we have this, we've demonized all burning, and I think that there's a baby in the bathwater, so to speak, in a similar way as the complexity of confined animal operations, which everyone should agree is horrendous. But there's also a very good way of managing livestock in landscapes that build soil faster than anything I've seen in 30 some years of looking at farms and looking at thousands of soil tests of trying to increase that soil carbon rapidly. I have seen and documented 3 percentage points of organic matter increase in 4 years' time with grazing systems that are very sophisticated, with nothing but cows and electric fence. I've seen similar numbers with cover cropping and the best of regenerative agriculture, but you have to subtract the fuels that are used in tractors and a lot of other pieces to get to that result. And so I'm looking at all of these systems as tools in our tool belt to get the critical work done, to buy ourselves the time to get to all the other issues. And I really think we are in a narrow window right now with our food supply, with the hydrological extremes of flooding, droughts, and fires. And the causation of those is very much about the soil and very much about the carbon that's in the soil that holds water, and the ability to open the pore structure up in the soil to absorb the rains so they don't run off, which immediately speaks to the flooding problem. And so if you have a flooding problem, you got a nutrient leaching problem, and you also have a drought problem coming quickly after because you didn't store the water that rained. So I guess I'll jump out of this. There's a lot to talk about in this, but we don't have time, so I'm going to keep moving. This was a statement that was made by probably one of the top soil scientists in the world at Ohio State, and it's talking about a 2% increase in carbon content of the planet's soils could offset 100% of all greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. Now, that's a tall order in terms of all of the world's soils. But like I said, I have seen 3% increase in 4 years on a 500-acre farm. And I've seen other ones that were even higher than that over a little bit of a longer period on a 5,000-acre farm, if you're familiar with Gabe Brown. Now, this is all embedded within a larger strategy of not just farming. I want to reiterate that this is looking at the world's grasslands and how we're going to manage those, all the world's forests, how we're going to manage those, the agricultural systems, mangrove systems, wetlands, and we can store carbon with strategies in all of those. And but moving right along, this is the piece with the background that I mentioned of, let's see if I guess you can all see this differently. I'm going to move the photos around a little bit. So what we're seeing here is an area in the Amazon basin, which is right on the equator compared to halfway to the equator where I was working and experiencing that difficulty of keeping carbon in the soil. When I became aware of this situation in the Amazon, I was completely blown away. And this was central to my interest in biochar as a potential major tool in our toolbox. So what we're looking at here is over 6 foot deep of very dark black soils. It's called terra preta. It was noted quite a while back by people who were in the Amazon early on, but it wasn't really fully. I wouldn't say it's fully understood now, but it's very understood that this is an anthropogenic soil here. That we're looking at these two soils. One is a terra preta soil, and one is soil right next to it that didn't get managed by human beings. So anthropogenic is basically a human-generated soil. And when you analyze the carbon in that soil, it is a large proportion of it is from biochar. It's not 100% understood how they did it, but it was probably done over about a 2,500-year period. But nothing has been done in 600 years to generate these soils, and they're still there. It gives you some idea here of the recalcitrant nature of the pyrogenic or heat-induced carbon by breaking down with pyrolysis of taking organic matter and turning it into char. You are capturing a portion of that carbon into a recalcitrant form that is astoundingly durable. It doesn't break down. If you go to in Virginia, if you're familiar with any of the archaeological sites or no archaeologists, and look at the the fire pits and the usually clay pottery and arrowheads and things that they're finding, they usually find fire pits, and the charcoal that's in those is still generally intact for a very long time. Now, whatever you were going to do with that organic matter that's not burning, if anybody thinks there's a better idea to not burn it, you can compost it, and you're going to capture a little bit of that carbon, but for the most part, no matter what you do, from about between 10 and 20 years, that carbon in wood products or in any kind of harvested agricultural material waste or anything you're really talking about is going to be back in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases, whether you can see a fire burning or not. Whether that's broken down by microbial activity, it's still oxidizing. And it's not durable. It's called labile carbon because it moves quickly back to the atmosphere. So what we're looking at here is a major lever to keep carbon around for a very long time. There's a lot to say about this terra preta, but I wanted to start by saying this is what really got my attention, particularly from working in the tropics in the non-dark soil version of that and all the issues that come with it. So this is probably the most interesting and important human activity that I know of, and I've been looking pretty hard at things that many hundreds of years later are still benefiting life, people, but also all the other life forms hundreds of years after something you do it. It's a very difficult thing to do, and this is one of the few examples I know of. You also have like terrace systems and some earth working systems that are pretty durable, and they catch water and they do a lot of good things as well. But I wanted to talk about this a little bit in the beginning. So this is the Amazon basin. The black dots are all of the aggregated places where these black earths or terra preta soils are. If you aggregate them all into one place, you'll have an area about the size of France. And so this is not a minor thing. This is a really big area that it is radically increased the soil health for many hundreds of years. There's another really interesting story that's kind of tragic. Well, more than kind of. But after the Spaniards first, arrived in the Amazon, they reported, very large civilizations that were basically the remnants of the people that were making these soils. And when they came back a while later, they couldn't find these people because they had basically spread European diseases and killed like 90+% of the population. And these soils went back to rapid tropical forest growth and pulled down so much carbon that it cooled. Some people believe that it was responsible for one of those little ice ages, not ice ages, but cool spells in Europe that corresponded with that timing. So there's a lot going on with where carbon is and how it affects microclimates and aggregated microclimates into macroclimates. I'll keep moving along here. So the way it really works is that inside of a tree, for example, which this is wood, you have xylem and phloem moving up and down, the liquids that are moving up and down in the tree, and they're carrying nutrients. And when you burn that tree, or when you do it in a certain way, where you don't burn it to ash, there's a critical point where you have to stop the burn and cut off the oxygen by either putting it out with water or putting it in an oxygen-free environment, and you'll save the carbon skeleton, the carbon structure, which acts a lot like a coral reef or something of really extreme biological activity in the soil. So there's about a football field per teaspoon of this charcoal of surface area. It's a tremendous amount of surface area in this, and that's what gives it such amazing ability to store water and to store biology, and to also store anions and cations, negative and positive charge, macro and micronutrients. So you can use this in we do a weekend workshop that Eli came to, and we go about 55 different uses for this once it's made. So the soil is an excellent long-term repository, but before it gets there, you can do a lot of cleaning up of the environment. You can pull toxins out of bodies of animals and people, many uses. But the key to it is this substructure inside of the charcoal, and it has an incredible amount of surface area. If you take a quart of charcoal, well, the difference between charcoal and biochar is just that biochar is used in a biological system as opposed to being used for fuel or something like that, which would be just charcoal. The other variation is that there's some differences depending on what temperature you're making it at. I'm not going to go into, well, we can get into details in the questions, but basically there's hardwoods and there's softwoods and there's other plant material, and what you use those for may depend on the, they'll all work fine in the soil, but if you're going to use it to gasify and run internal combustion engines, which I'll show you some examples of, a small proportion of it for that on farm for self-sufficiency. You would tend to use the hardwood species for that, and the softwood more for the soil end use, composting, livestock systems, etc. So even like something like straw has a micro pore structure in it that can be utilized as well. So this is really so when you're making the charcoal, approximately half of the carbon is maintained after the burn, is locked into this long-term recalcitrant carbon, about a third of the volume. And so for every pound of biochar, there's 3 pounds of CO2 have been pulled out of the atmosphere, essentially permanently, hundreds to thousands of years. So that's where it's very different than anything else you're doing with handling organic matter and what you're going to do with it. And there's a place for all of these different methods of handling, composting, mulching, and so forth. But the biochar component is by far the longest lasting. Now, as soil studies become more, the depth of soil studies are getting clearer, there's some of these humic and fulvic compounds are pretty long lasting as well. And those are really kind of the holy grail of soil health. The charcoal is more of a structural system, a lattice work that can hold biology and hold a lot of the water and the air and the functions that the life of the soil is up to. So let's see. This is just a real simple slide. Like I said, I've got 55 different uses, which goes into many more. But so what we're going to talk about some here is basically making biochar, but so most people's evolution on biochar starts with standing around a fire or doing some simple burn where you're not getting much more. Well, there's entertainment and you can maybe cook some food on the fire, but you're not capturing most of the energy that's lost in the burn. The real challenge becomes, how do you capture as much of that energy as possible? We'll talk about some examples of that, and how you can displace a tremendous amount of grid electricity, of fracked gases, of all the things that you would use otherwise. And so it's like I said, it's one piece of a multi-tiered strategy. Eli mentioned that I live off the grid for the last 40 years with solar electricity and solar hot water. But there's bottlenecks in the year where you don't have enough sun, that is, where you'll either have, I'll get to it later, but the snow is on the solar panels, or the sun's just not out in the first place, and you have to have a backup system. So part of what I want to talk about is how we manage these landscapes, because it's really a full strategy landscape management process. And so the opportunities seem to be in forest management, in taking pasture and turning it more into silvopasture, getting more trees, because a big part of what's happening with the warming is that it's increasing oxidation, a lot like the tropical experience that I had, where the soil temperature becomes critical. If your soil temperature is high, if you got exposed soil, it's going to be just basically killing all the microbes in the top inch or so, plus it's going to be oxidizing the organic matter that you're trying to hold on to. Getting trees in that system is really important for moisture. Anybody who's walked into a forest on a really dry, drought part of the summer, where it's hot and dry, you can immediately feel that 10 to 15 degree temperature cool down. You can feel the humidity in the air. You can see plants that are growing that, when out in the open in the field, it's often cracked ground, especially if the organic matter is low in those soils. So I'm also working with a lot of herbalists, and I'm on the advisory board of United Plant Savers, which is a medicinal plant conservation organization that works with a lot of endangered medicinals. And a lot of those are in forest environments. So one of the things that you see historically is that native peoples and this entire continent was being prescribed burned by native peoples to create landscapes where the most productive forests and ecosystems that any Europeans had ever seen when they first came to North America. And that was done very largely with fire. And what they did was they were burning strategically and timings in regards to, and this is really what was happening with the terra preta soils as well, to some degree, where you'd burn with knowing that the rains were going to come and put it out and make charcoal, knowing that you were going to open up the understory, you were going to reduce the fuel load for terrible hot fires. What you want is frequent cool fires that generate carbon, but also change the pH depending on the acidity of the ecosystem. It reduces the competition between trees, so the fruit and nut trees and the wildlife food, all of those productivity aspects are increased by thinning out the forest in some way. Now, I think that we're in a different time now where we have a lot of people that need work, and I think we have an opportunity to do the thinning manually and run the thinned material through pyrolysis technology, where we can make electricity, we can make hot water, we can displace all of these fossil fuel issues, and then end up with 50% of the carbon in the system for hundreds to thousands of years. So it's really the math of that durable part of the carbon where you have to get to understand the value. So on one end, you've got forest thinning, and an opportunity arises to be producing a lot of non-timber forest products, as well as some mixed age, mixed species stands of healthy forest ecosystems, and some wood harvesting as well. But on the forest floor, the whole gamut of medicinal plants, things like golden seal and ginseng and mushrooms and maple syrup and all kinds of economy that can come out of the forest once we get past that mindset where the forest is just board feet of lumber, which is a tragically narrow view. So the other aspect I mentioned was taking open pastures that are increasingly drying up and hard on animals when you get to the hot, dry part of the year. We're already seeing this, and you can go to dairy farms in Wisconsin and many places. Anybody who's integrated silvopasture, the animals are much better off. They're cooler, they eat all day rather than laying in some edge of a field panting somewhere, and milk production and all the productivity goes down. So we have the opportunity to plant in trees, and there's a fantastic book Steve Gabriel has written recently from Cornell, a book on silvopasture, and a lot of the species that the leaves of the trees that you can plant for shade are already very high quality forage. They're as good as lots of the crops that people grow to feed animals. And I've been doing a lot of organic inspection work recently on grass-fed dairy and beef operations, where you take the grain out of the picture. And so you can do the top end of the soil building grazing cycles underneath of a partial canopy, and you can be harvesting that wood. You can be lopping branches. There's many different techniques of coppicing and pollarding and so forth without getting too technical, where you're getting animal feed, and then they would be eating the leaves off the branches, and you'd be taking those branches and making biochar from that, with all the outcomes from that again. The alley cropping is another way that we can take cropland and put in strips of trees. Those can be coppicable trees like nitrogen fixing black locust, for example, that you don't really kill the tree. You're cutting them to maintain the amount of light to the crops in between them and to the food crop trees that are in between them in the row. So you can add a lot of different functions. And so what I've seen all over the world that I've been to in areas that have the best food security and the best ecological management, indigenous systems, is that you never find a landscape that's only one thing. It's only soybeans or only food even. It's always medicine, it's always building materials, it's always craft materials and spiritual values, and on and on and on. So we need to really stretch our minds out a bit on what natural design, why it's the way it is, and look at some, what I usually advocate is locating functional reference points in landscapes, in cultural models, in anything you're trying to improve on. And once you have a functional reference point, you can move toward that rather than just moving away from something that's horrendous, like a confined animal operation or a toxic chemical monoculture. These are obviously wrong, but it doesn't, when you move away from that randomly, it doesn't tell you exactly what you want to be heading toward. And so if you have functional reference points, then you will have a fire under your butt for the rest of your life to get to the top end, rather than just getting comfortably a little bit better than really dumb. So I think it's an important navigational point. So yeah, we got windbreaks and riparian zones along streams. I'm looking at some of the ancient food plants of pre-corn in North America right now that can be grown in riparian zones without plowing. For example, something called Iva annua that has 40% oil in it. and it is being found in these archaeological digs before corn and tomatoes and peppers and potatoes and all those things migrated north from down in Central and South America. So there's a lot of things we can do. These riparian zones can be fully functional and loaded with many dozens of plants that are functioning for the riparian buffer, but also to be producing food and medicine and thinning wood. Because when you pull the fossil fuel rug out from underneath of this culture right now, you really have to get a lot done. You have to think about how you're going to do that. It's blinding, really. You know, we've been blinded by this. You know, it's essentially like slave labor. You know, when you don't have to do it yourself, you don't really understand that you're burning 20 calories of energy to make one in modern agriculture, right? It's like you're cutting butter with a chainsaw, but if you were doing it with hand tools, you would know exactly, you would improve in so many ways so quickly. But our imagination has been very, very dampened down by the history of access to fossil fuel and slaves. And when we basically come, and when I say slaves, I'm talking about historically, but also present day relationships with other countries where their labor is valued at almost nothing, and their resources are being extracted by so-called first world countries and developed countries. It's kind of backwards in a lot of ways, but as far as who's developed and so forth, but we won't get into that right now. So anyway, there's a lot that we can do with these, virtually every landscape. So if you show me a landscape, we can have a conversation about it. So agroforestry, there's a lot to read up on, a lot to consider. I'm looking at right now, I'm excited at, I'll show you the unit that I'm making biochar with, that's making electricity and hot water and space heat, and hopefully season extension in a greenhouse before long. But one of the things I'm looking at right now is nutshells. So we have an opportunity to not even have to chip wood in the first place, but to grow, say, walnuts and be able to have wood, be able to have nuts, be able to have oil, be able to feed after the oil is pressed, and then to take the shells and run them through a biochar pyrolysis process and get electricity and hot water and space heat, etc. So that's what's been exciting me lately, and I'll show you. I'm going to mostly talk about what I've seen working. There's a lot of potential that I won't get into until I do see it working, but I have seen some larger scale systems that are very interesting. I'll talk about those as well. But by putting these rows of trees, you're protecting the microclimate and keeping it from drying out, blocking the winds. And the total, if the crops and the trees are producing a crop as well, the total of all of it is more than the sum of the parts in general, in a well-designed agroforestry system. You've got some good resource people near you at Virginia Tech, John Munsell and others you may know. There's a lot going on in this area in your neck of the woods, so look into it. Already mentioned about the potential for grazing systems. There's a lot of soils that just don't grow other crops very well, right? So if grasslands are, there's very productive in terms of soil carbon. And then there's some of the C4 plants, which are different types of photosynthesis, and the C4 grasses are extremely productive in carbon, and building it below ground and making it above ground. And if you optimize the grazing of that, what you have are basically living compost systems on legs that are moving around and distributing it and digesting it and making, it's really about nutrient cycling at the end of the day. You want to have a lot of nutrients moving up and down. And so, I guess I don't need to talk too much more about that, other than the fact that this is a potentially tremendous soil building opportunity. And on top of the best practices of grazing, the best practices of agroforestry, and the leaf fall that's falling and helping build soil, and the branches. On top of that, you've got potential for some harvesting and putting the biochar back in. And so when you're putting biochar back into the soil, you really need to load all that surface area with nutrients. You don't want to put it in raw because it'll pull nutrients out of the soil for a period. So you have to load it. And animal livestock, you can actually feed about 1% of the diet to livestock, and it'll prepare the manure coming out the other end already. And it absorbs odors, it binds things so that it doesn't wash away into the streams or wind up in dead zones in Lake Erie or off of New Orleans, etc. So the biochar can really capture a lot of the nutrients that are washing away out of our systems and into the rivers and into bodies of water. And so there's amazing potential for bioremediation at point source, not waiting until it gets all the way down there, but doing it at each farm or each toxic point and stop it in its tracks before it gets to the first order stream. I do a lot of work with, this is on our farm, and do a lot of work with cover cropping and see just absolutely amazing results with really healthy cover crops. Even like Ohio State is talking about being able to see big changes up to 6 years later after one single good cover crop in the soil. So I haven't used any nitrogen fertilizer in at least 15 years. And those were organic forms of nitrogen when I did. But I've moved more just toward minerals and cover cropping at this point. And getting, in my larger slideshow, I've got a lot more about food and nutrient density and seed diversity and all kinds of other points. But right now, for the to add the biochar into this system helps to capture these nutrients. What you're doing with cover crops is you're juggling these nutrients. You're pulling them up out of the deeper soil and then trying to keep them around keep the nutrients around at the surface for your other crops. And so it's kind of a juggling act, and the biochar really helps to hold those nutrients where you want them. Lots to talk about on cover crops, but that's not what we're talking about, so I'll keep moving. So some of these landscapes where you can integrate tree cropping, and in this case, pastured poultry and fruit and nut production and produce, you can get a lot going on. It's very difficult to maintain the nutrients properly in any ecosystem without animals. Most people in regenerative agriculture would agree that livestock is a key piece, or animals are a key piece of any ecosystem. But unless you have like the kind of density of animal populations that you used to see in the Great Plains with the bison or in the Serengeti in Africa, and you have large predators, we've gotten rid of our predators, so we don't get the density of animals that can really make the kind of progress we need in these nutrient cycling systems. We have to kind of manipulate that. And poultry is a fairly easy one. I have a friend in Minnesota, is a Guatemalan man who's amazing, has pioneered an incredible poultry system. His name is Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin. I would highly recommend, I can get you some links and stuff afterwards, Eli, that you can share if people are interested. But it's as different of an animal operation of anything that you've ever heard of. It simultaneously rapidly restores economic systems, social systems, and ecological systems. He calls it tree range poultry, or poultry-centered regenerative agroforestry. So he and I had both done a lot of work. He's from Central America, but he was working not very far from where I was working and doing multi-strata agroforestry systems in the tropics as well. But he's up in the north now. So anyway, there's a lot of landscape conversation. Most people that talk about biochar don't really deal with ecological sourcing of feedstocks, and that's a very important piece. And we can only, you know, talk a little bit about it tonight, but there's a lot to talk about on how you create landscapes that the cutting of the biomass to produce the feedstocks is actually benefiting the plants that you're leaving behind. You're opening up air movement and you're opening up sunlight into crop plants, and you can be doing that with things like nitrogen fixers and so forth. So it's a fairly sophisticated landscape model when you get into it, and takes a lot more people per acre than most North Americans are going to probably be interested in. But the reality is that if you look at worldwide, and we're facing a fairly imminent food crisis right now. We've been in a food crisis in terms of quality, but if you look at what's happening right now with the cutting off of something like 40% of the potassium fertilizer coming out of Russia, and that whole scenario is really bottlenecking a lot of the fertilizers right at a time when we've killed off most of the soil biology that is required to grow food at a high quality, I would argue, but also at all without these crutches. You know, we've made basically heroin addicts out of our soil to where they have to have water soluble fertilizers to get a result, because the biology that normally would have been there has been fried, and the nitrogen fertilizer will rapidly increase the oxidation of organic matter. So it's like a perfect storm, right when we need the food the most. But the point that I want to make is that even with all of the hype about modern agriculture, it's really not the place we should be looking in the first place, because industrialized agriculture is using about 70% of the world's agricultural land and is producing 30% of the world's food. And it's the least nutritious food, and it's the most toxic food, and it loses the most soil, it pollutes the most water. It's the most dysfunctional part of the system we could talk about. Meanwhile, what we're not talking about is that small landholders, indigenous peoples, are growing, indigenous and small landholders all over the world. If you look at all the continents, South America, India, China, all over, 70% of the world's food supply is coming from these small farms that are extremely diversified. I could go into great detail on what I've looked at in anthropology and also personally in Central America and in Asia. And it's really amazing to me, because there's way less inputs going into these places. There's way more plant diversity. There's generally more soil health, and definitely more nutritional capacity. So that's what we should be focusing on anyway. And I think that the biochar works really well on these small systems where you're making, and I'll show you how we can make it on a small scale for anybody, no matter where they are. Maybe not in an apartment in the city, but almost. So let's see. So thinning out the forest and growing, this is golden seal, but I just wanted to make the point of, in the tropics, I would have been growing chocolate in a situation like this with bigger trees, but this is just the only slide I could get my hands on the other day. So the point is that you're thinning the forest so that you're decreasing competition. You're opening up a little bit of light and some air movement in terms of fungal problems. And then you can begin to grow a lot of things on the forest floor in that rich soil. And the thinnings that you take out is the feedstocks for these strategies for biochar and growing mushrooms and all sorts of other things. Really, I guess what I'm talking about is cellulose being the next, replacement for fossil fuel. The things that fossil fuels do, we can use cellulose, harvested cellulose from very rapid growing systems, and taking the part that is expendable. So if you look at a particular plant, say a plant or a tree, the way it breaks down is that you've got 30% of the carbon is below ground, 30% is above ground that you can see, and 40% is in exudates exuded into the soil from the down through that, that structure we were looking at in the xylem and phloem in the charcoal, is being pumped into the soil to feed microbial species that are creating. It's the equivalent of like what happens in a healthy human gut, that those microbes and the whole soil food web is being driven by 40% of the photosynthetic process of a given plant. So the point I guess I'm getting at is that we have a lot of leeway on how we use some portion of that above ground harvested material. And if we're banking half of it into the soil for hundreds to thousands of years, we're really getting ahead of the game here. We're looking at a carbon negative process where we're not just imagining about doing less carbon into the atmosphere. We're talking about taking carbon out of the atmosphere and kind of turning that whole problem around. And like I said, the problem isn't directly because of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's what it would have been doing if it wasn't in the atmosphere, in the soil, in the trees, in the animals, and so forth. And that's a whole other conversation, but I would highly recommend, if people aren't familiar with and are interested in climate science, a man named Walter Jehne, Jehne. There's a lot of stuff on YouTube that he's done. I think there's a pretty good one, I think, is the Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, had him speak. All of his talks are about 2 hours, so strap in. But critical information, and I mean, I could go into, but we don't have time tonight. But so let's see, varying forms of what we do in forests. We talked about grazing. This is a system called Keyline, Keyline soil management. It's more than soil. It's also, I have another slide that shows the series of ponds, but you're capturing water, you're keeping it from running off. Now these are basically ripped, well, there's a little bit to it, but you can do this where you're making swales that fill up with water when it rains, and you can plant trees along those swales and crop in between them. But what you're generally doing is you're moving the water from that would be running down ravines out to the dry ridges, and you're like 1 inch and 10 feet drop. So there's a bunch to it, and what you're generally doing is you're capturing water at the higher points of your landscape, and you're letting it percolate in. So what you don't catch in the ponds goes into these swales, and it sinks into the land. The tree roots have access to it, so even in dry weather, you can get major reforestation done. And so while you're ripping that, this is like a chisel plow that you're plowing, and you can be dropping in biochar that's loaded with the minerals and biology and everything you want to get in there. You start shallow, and as each pass you do, you go down into the subsoil a little bit deeper. And you can literally go from 5 inches of topsoil to 18 inches of topsoil in 5 years if you do this. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of horsepower, but there's a lot of things we can do quickly, and we need to do a lot of things quickly because we don't have a huge amount of time for some of these transitions before we bottleneck our food supply and other extremes in terms of weather that's here and coming stronger for sure. I mean, there's really no way around that. So, modifying microclimates locally, yes.
Mark, it's so interesting. I could keep listening to you for 2 hours, but I'm not sure if I want to get a couple questions in before it gets shut off. I don't know the time limit, but can I ask a couple of questions or?
Absolutely, yeah.
Melanie, we were gonna allow for clarifying questions. So, but we were going to have a half an hour or 30 minutes for a general discussion after the presentation.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll wait.
Are any of them clarifying of things that you want to clarify what I asked? Okay, we'll get to your questions. Hold on to them, write them down. Eli, what's the time? Can you give me a time check?
Yeah, okay. We started a little bit late, so I'd give you to about 8:10, and it's 7:56 right now. And the other part that I'm hoping you get to is how you make the charcoal.
Yes, okay, let's keep moving. Well, this is the slide. So, this is on a small scale. What you have here is this is an outdoor, I don't know if you can see can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a simple outdoor fire pit that you just make a fire just like you would normally do. There's a grill on it for cooking once you have the fire going well, but you just basically have a campfire with some people and you throw a lot of wood in, you just keep it going. And what happens is that the flame keeps the oxygen from getting to the wood very effectively. It's kind of creating that oxygenless environment underneath the flame. And so when it gets to the point where it's burnt down to all coals, you then cook your food on it, and then you pour water on it to stop. And you can get about 20 gallons of biochar in one burn from that. This is a cook stove this is Gary Gilmore, a guy I teach with that Eli met. He designed this stove that's just with I think this is a 30-gallon barrel. It's got a 5-gallon metal can full of wood or bamboo or anything you want to burn, and you start it and you close it and cook on it. And then when the flames burn down, you reach in with a leather glove and you pull out the 5-gallon can and put a new 5-gallon can and light it again if you want to keep going, if you're doing a sauna or whatever you want to do. So that's another way. There's a way that you take 2 55-gallon drums and you put about 3 to 4 inch long by 1 to 1.5 inch openings in the bottom. You leave the bottom intact and you have an open top, and you load that full of wood with the smaller stuff on top, and you light that, and then you take a second drum once it starts burning very well, and you take a second drum with no top and no bottom, which is just basically a chimney, and you put it on top of that, and it takes about 2 hours, and it'll burn. The flame will do the same thing, but it's going to burn down toward the oxygen of those small holes at the bottom. And when you see that they're glowing at the bottom, in other words, the coals have reached all the way to the bottom, you then cover those holes with soil, and then the burn will go toward to each one of those holes. And when all of them are glowing red, you cover all of them with soil and you pull off the top drum and you clamp a lid on there so to cut off the oxygen, and it'll go out and you'll have about 1/3 of the volume of charcoal that way. There are other methods that you can make that I'd say are less clean burning, which I'm less likely to advocate, but you can dig holes that replicate that burner over there, like a pyramid shape. You can do a longer version of that in a trench. If you have like a lot of brush you want to burn, you'll generally have to have water to put it out with, or be able to move enough soil. I'd say water is going to be your likely thing. You can mix some things into the water, like some of the really finely powdered minerals. I use some volcanic minerals that are tremendous for growing plants. They just change everything that no matter how long people have been gardening and farming, these minerals will make things happen that basically people haven't seen. And we're looking mainly for growing, we're looking for signals. We have tools now. We can measure very sophisticated measurement on nutrient density, but to just use your own senses, you've got flavor, you've got smell, you've got pigmentation of the brightness of colors in the food, the shelf life is a big one, and then the insect and disease resistance. If you're seeing all those things happening, you know you're heading in the right direction. So those are some methods, and these are all ways that you're basically cooking food. The drum method, you're not capturing much, but you could modify it to probably have like a lazy Susan that spins around with different drums on it, and maybe for example, a maple syrup boiler where you have one burn and then for 2 hours, and then you move to the next one, and then you keep it going like that, and then keep loading it and unloading it. You could be making a lot of charcoal by making maple syrup. But getting things done is the point. So this is a little stove that I like. It works fantastic. We use it a lot for making corn tortillas or just general cooking. This was a Paul Anderson designed this one. It's called the Champion Stove because it won the global challenge of clean burning efficient cooking worldwide. Because if you look at the amount of respiratory problems and blindness that's occurring mostly with women who are cooking over wood fires around the world, there's a big demand for clean burning cooking, and this stove won that award. So when the flames go down and you're cooking and the flames go down, it's time to open it up and dump it into a bucket of water and load it up again. Right, so that's a small scale, but it makes very nice biochar. And I've got bamboo that I really need to cut a lot of, and bamboo works really well. And the interesting thing about bamboo is like rocket fuel, but it's also very high in silica. So you wind up having a very silica-rich charcoal. And the whole role of silica is very interesting, and it was largely ignored as an important piece of soil chemistry. And it's tricky to get the silica to be plant available, much like nitrogen. You know, nitrogen takes a biological pathway to become available. And similarly with silica, it's the majority of all rock in the ground, right? And all the soils are breaking down from silicate type rocks, and yet hard to come by in terms of plant availability. It's having the right microbes and fungi in the soil is always the key to almost everything. But in nitrogen is an interesting story because it's 78% of our atmosphere. It's everywhere. There's a giant column of nitrogen over every square inch of soil on the planet. There should be no nitrogen needs, but you have to have nitrogen fixing bacteria for it. And so it's all about biology. So those are a few smaller methods. Once you have charcoal, this is a gasifier that my friend Gary designed. And you know, it's mainly all going back to the soil, but instead of burning diesel or gasoline and all that brings in the world, we decided we like to grow and make everything we can on the farm. And so this here can run any internal combustion engine up to about 18 horsepower. For this particular size, you could make them bigger. I believe I've got one I can show you in a minute that'll run a walk-behind tractor for smaller farms and yards. But basically, it's gasifying the charcoal to run the engine. So here's a crude one. This old stainless milk container has charcoal in it, and it's got a little 12-volt fan that pumps air through it, and you light that, and then you basically have some filters for taking some things out of the gas, and it goes right into the carburetor. Now I've got a larger version of this that I'm in the process of transforming, And the nice thing about it, because on a gravely, you've got the whole gamut of implements. You've got, all the types of mowers and tillers and cultivators and all the farm related stuff, but you can also, modify them and run things like, he's got a thing that grinds the charcoal on here. So he's got a hopper that you put the charcoal that's already loaded. You're burning some charcoal. You got a hopper with loaded charcoal with, fish emulsion and whatever else you've got in it. And then it grinds it and throws it to both sides as you're driving through the field. So he's a super innovative guy. And so anyway, let's see. Well, I guess that takes us, this is my house and where I am right now. And in the middle of winter, when the snow's on the solar panels and it's cold outside and the solar hot water, you can't see the solar hot water panels, but I need hot water for the house and I need electricity to keep my batteries charged. And if you have a way to make electricity to keep your batteries topped up on a regular basis, the longevity of those batteries is going to last up to twice as long. So, the new batteries are expensive. You could spend easy $12,000 on a set of batteries, but you'll probably get 10 plus years out of them. But the point is, you get a lot more years out of them if you keep them charged in the winter when you're normally drawing them way down all the time. Without getting into the technical part of it, I started getting very interested and started working with some engineers and people who had actually designed the I think it's a free piston Stirling engine. I think it's free piston, something piston Stirling engine. But anyway, a type of Stirling engine that was developed about 20 minutes from where I live. And I'm working with some of the engineers who worked with the original design, which then got sold to some folks in the Netherlands, working with them too, re-importing the Stirling engine and putting them into this unit, which is as close to the best of what I've found yet. And what this does is it takes wood pellets or wood chips. I'm working on the wood chip system because in order for this small auger to take wood chips, they've got to be very uniform in size, and almost no wood chipper does that. I found one company in Finland that makes one that I'm trying to find a shipper to get one imported. But so that's going to take some. It's all R&D, but so I've been running mine for about 2 years now and working a bunch of the kinks out, and then we're about to test. I've been getting these to some friends of mine in North Carolina at Living Web Farms. They've got a lot of videos that are worth looking into if you haven't checked them out yet. But they have one and they tested it on walnut shells and it worked really well. And walnut shells are really dense, have a good BTU level and so forth. So down in here is the actual Stirling engine. It goes, so the, let's see. So the pellets go up or the chips go up and there's a gasifier in, this is where the gases are burning. It's right here is where the gases go through over into the drum, which is here. This is where the gases are coming in. And then this moves up and the cone of the Stirling engine is sitting in about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's making and then on the bottom of it, you have to pump water or because it's so cold, I'm using antifreeze and pumping that to cool. What you want to do is get a differential of temperature. And if you got the 1800 degrees at the top and you're trying to desperately cool that bottom as much as you can to get the most electricity, because you got a piston going up and down inside of it, but by cooling it, you're making a whole bunch of hot water, 8 times as much energy as you're making electricity. And so, yes, clarifying
Mark.
question?
I do have a clarifying question. Is that system also producing biochar, or is this primarily gasification?
Nope, this is gasifying wood and it's pyrolyzing the wood up to the point of biochar. And then it's dropping down into this tube right down here where it's robbed of oxygen and it goes out. And you have to pull that little handle and drop out that much biochar every 12 hours, which is about 12 to 15 pounds of biochar every 12 hours. And it's using about 6 pounds of wood an hour. But that, I ran it, the last time I ran it, it was about 20 degrees outside, and it heated my whole house, toasty warm. It had way more electricity than I could use, so I was running an electric heater after my batteries were topped up. So, and then it was making and then I got, from one evening, I got like 4 or 5 gallon buckets of biochar, high quality biochar.
Wow.
So
Can you,
this is,
do you have time to, can we switch now to Melody's questions?
Yeah, I was going to say that
the time?
you run into the 810 that I had mentioned.
okay. Can I have like about 3 minutes and I'll just run through the rest of my slides?
Okay.
Okay. So this is what I'm running the hot water into the house, into a Ford radiator, and the fans are blowing the heat into the house. I'm going to be doing this differently and putting it into my hot water tank for my solar tank and using the hot water in the floor later. But all of this can be adapted to greenhouses or houses or commercial kitchens or anything you want. That's the point. So these are wood chips. This is now, I'm going to jump real quick to a much larger system of 10 30 by 90 greenhouses that you can grow food all year long in. And this is about how much it uses a day. And this auger goes into this boiler. This is the boiler. It's improved since then, but this is about 2.5 million BTUs of hot water it's producing. There's 10 of these greenhouses that it's heating all winter long in Missouri. This black pile here is where they just took a triaxle load of biochar to another farm that I went and inspected. It was an organic poultry operation, and they were using it under the floor to pull the ammonia out without getting too technical. But every poultry operation, even the organic ones that have outdoor pasture, are producing ammonia inside. And when the ammonia levels go up, they have to open vents and turn on fans. And what the ammonia is a smog component in the air. It's an air pollutant, but it's also nitrogen. So if you put charcoal under the floor, because the eggs, they didn't want to get any black specks on the eggs, right? So they put it under the floor, they blew the air underneath of it, the biochar absorbed the ammonia, captured the nitrogen for the farm, and mixed it with the poultry manure for compost, and then saved the electricity from the fans and saved the heat that was blowing out the window, because if it's 55 degrees or colder, these operations are burning propane. So you're saving the propane, you're capturing the nitrogen, you're cleaning the air, et cetera, et cetera. We can take it farther and look at how to produce it on site and get into absorption chillers and run walk-in coolers and freezers and things like that too. So this story keeps going.
Right.
This is just a shot of my garden where I'm using all these things in the non-winter months. And this is, we don't have time to go into this, but this gets into measuring ecosystem services and how to measure the things that are changing as we're making the improvements from all of these different techniques. So let's go to the questions now then.
Okay.
I want to appreciate
Thank
your
you, Mark. That's fascinating. Melody, do you want to kick it off with your question?
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. It's fabulous information. 2 questions. I have 21 acres, mostly forest. It's been, untouched for decades. So there's lots of dead trees, and I want to clear it out. I mean, it was done once a couple years ago with one portion of it, but it could end up with a 2-story high burn pile. But I don't want to burn it. I want to how can I make biochar? That's one question. The second question is, do you have a book or something that you can recommend to, to have some kind of growth in the forest? Like you had a slide about plants growing in between the trees in a forest.
Yeah, I think so the same guy that had the book, Steve Gabriel, he's got a book on farming the forest, I believe. I think that would be a good one. There's a lot of books. We could work on a reading list, over time. But the other one, like just for learning about biochar, there's Albert Bates has got a book called The Biochar Solution. There's a journal called the Ithaca Journal or the Biochar Journal, is a pretty serious journal on technical stuff. This guy Johannes Lehmann, anything by him is very good. As far as how to make it at that scale, there's a conversation, like about like your group, for example, could consider buying a unit that is on wheels. One that comes to mind is the Exeter retort out of England. A friend of mine was selling them here in Ohio, and we had one that was floating around where you could pull it on a trailer and pull it up to your piles that you had made and then load it. That particular one is about 8 feet long and about 5 feet in diameter. And so there's a little bit of work there, to do it. There's another ways that my friend Gary, that same guy, he's a blacksmith, and any of the blacksmiths of old know how to do this stuff. But you can stack it in a way in the forest, basically stack them in one direction, then cross and back and back and back and back, and stack it up 10, 15 feet high and light it from the top and let it burn from the top down. This is a simple version because we don't have a huge amount of time, but there's some videos on YouTube. I think we could find you. There's a really interesting old guy in Maryland that I know did a YouTube video on it. But what the key to that is you have to take about 205-gallon buckets or have like some kind of a pump with like a fire hose where you can put it out at the right time. So he does it with about, I forget, it's 100 or 205-gallon buckets full of water all the way around the burn. He burns it and he starts throwing the water on the pile at the right time. And by the time he's got it put out, he can fill all those same buckets back with biochar, and he uses it for metalworking. But it'll work both ways, right? That's at least a fast answer for your questions. I don't know how many other questions we have, but
we have a handful that have been submitted, but is there anybody else who's here in the audience who wants to ask one first?
Well, I do. Wouldn't we, Melanie, consider a flame cap trench? Because what her materials are likely bulky materials, and therefore putting it into 55-gallon drums is a tedious affair to get things to be that small. But the flame cap method will allow bulky materials if you have them in quantity, but it wouldn't capture the cogeneration of the energy, right, but it would allow the production of charcoal in bulk with a fairly simple technology.
Yeah, there's also regional possibilities of people aggregate. There's a couple ideas. I began looking at the smallest of the largest systems, which was small enough to put on a semi-truck, because I was looking at managing like 10 to 30,000 acre blocks of forest in the Ozarks, where you'd have a lot of material. And if you had one of these units, and these units could make a kind of a synthetic diesel fuel, or it could make a lot of electricity. But if you're in a remote location and you can't sell that electricity back, you could make diesel ore, and that technology exists. So it's one of those things where it's kind of connected to a conversation that I had in the county where I live, where the county commissioner is a friend of mine, and we were talking about particularly the summer air conditioning demand for electricity creates a spike that's really expensive, and they have to like build extra power plants, or it's a very expensive time of the year to make electricity. If a county wanted to do this, you could aggregate everybody's wood, take your wood, and everybody, you know, who wanted to could maybe get, I don't know, tax write-offs or whatever, and then have a very large building under roof to keep it dry, and then fire a unit, like a large unit that would be under that roof, to make that electricity to take that spike away, because you can put it in the millions of dollars, you know, what that spike represents to create. And I've had this conversation as well. I just haven't had time to develop it because people kind of have to put their money where their mouth is to make them happen. But we have not exhausted the possibilities by any stretch of the imagination on virtually anything. So that's the upside of being asleep at the wheel on fossil fuels for so long, is that there's a lot of unexplored territory that we can access.
Okay. Anybody else have a question from the audience? I've got a few that have been submitted with registration that I can go through. Not seeing anybody. Just, you can either raise your hand or type it in the chat, whatever you want to do. But let me go on with this question. This is from me. I was at a meeting today with our new director of our landfill, our local landfill, and they burn quite a bit of their brush. They don't take anything over 8 inches in diameter, so they're looking more at the smaller brushy yard, kind of thing, or clearing kinds of operations from landscaping. Could they be, instead of just burning it in a bonfire, basically, could they be making biochar out of that and have a product at the end? That's question number one. And number two is, what is the market for biochar? Is it something you could sell?
Both good questions. The answer to the first is absolutely yes, you could be making that. The people I showed you the slides of the larger scale systems that were heating the 10 greenhouses. They've got systems that are 10 times that size. So yes, they could easily make them an operation that would produce a lot of hot water. If you could figure out, if you could aggregate, say, next to the landfill, a large greenhouse operation, for example, or something that could utilize hot water, some large building that needed to be heated or whatever, you could be co-generating heat and biochar from that wood. Absolutely. And if they're interested, have them give me a call. I think Eli's got my information, and anybody who's listening tonight can contact him and get my information too, if you want to just talk about something or look at how to to get one of these home scale units or something larger, or just any question about anything really. Yeah, I think that it's really gets into how inefficient it is to have one single function for anything. When you start aggregating kind of ecosystems of industrial processes, or where there's no waste, because if you've got waste, anything that's perceivable as waste, you haven't done your design work. That's called incomplete design. Design in nature has zero waste. So that's what we're looking at. We need to close all the loops, and there's ways of doing that every time if you have the ability to design. Now, we tend to be retrofitting because things are already built. So we do a lot of unfortunate, like that situation with that poultry operation with the biochar under the floor. It sounds good, but it's only because it's a bad design in the first place. We can design poultry systems that are infinitely better than that, that you still would use some biochar, effectively, but not because there was an ammonia problem necessarily, but because there's other reasons to still use it. It'll balance that poultry, that high nitrogen poultry manure. It'll absorb it and so forth. But so everything is a matter of, how do we design it from scratch, or what do we have to work with, and how do we best retrofit that situation? And it seems like most of the work is going to be about retrofitting, but that can be done too.
Great. Well, so how about the market part of that question?
Oh, okay.
If we have an operation of some sort that is producing biochar, what's the market for that? Could our landfill, for example, or any other operation, be marketing that product as a soil amendment or for whatever other use?
Definitely two layers to that. One is trying to think of the units of how much. I want to say $300 to $400 for a tote, like the kind of totes that grains come in and things commonly used. Roughly is about the price these days. And there's also, so I just did a kind of an analysis for a 2-acre greenhouse in Vermont, and they've been using natural gas, and they want to get away from the whole fracking cycle thing and fossil fuels in general. So I think they're going to wind up going with heat pumps, but that's electricity, and it's only as good as the renewability of the electricity, and it definitely won't give you a positive soil carbon outcome no matter what you do with renewables, other than something like this, or maybe biogas slurry. But but what came out of that was, they had 2 acres of greenhouses, which is 4 times the size of that system I showed you in the slide. And we calculated that they could use 2 of those units, a little bigger than that one that I showed you. And it would be making about 200 tons of biochar a year to run, because they were I think even more than that, because they're using it in the summertime to grow tomatoes, and I guess they're cool enough up there where they could use the extra heat even in the summer in Vermont. But the point was that there's $300 carbon credit available per ton, as well as the price of the biochar that's being sold. Now that's a changing story here, but as people learn more about it and have more funding for carbon, some of those are funky, those carbon credit things, but if you're putting if you wind up putting enough biochar into the soil on an acre of land, for example, after you've loaded it with nutrients from a livestock operation or something else, and you have the equivalent of 1 percentage point of organic matter, that's 28,000 gallons of water storage per acre. That's just water. That's not getting into the nutrients and the biology and all that, but just in water, 28,000 gallons of water storage per acre. So if you're increasing it with the grazing system in the way that I said, where you're getting 3 percentage points in 4 years, and you're adding the equivalent of another one in biochar, you see they all accumulate. And maybe you're composting and adding some compost, but all these soils could be really advanced, would continue to improve up to 8-10% organic matter easy. So there's endless room in the soil. You saw those numbers on that early slide. That's where most of the carbon in our atmosphere came from, was from the soil and from the forests and from the wetlands and the carbon that was in all these places. So we really need to get the biology back to where they are, but it's immediately banking in a positive way, any of that gets into the soil properly. So
we've come to the end of our hour and a half. Of course, we didn't resolve all the issues. We just scratched the surface. So we know we didn't. And you presented a lot of stuff that was like on the apparatus. I'm sure there was some questions about how all that really works. So I think while we what we've done though is we've stimulated interest. And Melanie, I will say that talk to me later and I will offer some thoughts on your situation. And so people here locally that are interested in, you can call me and I've taken Mark's class and have been a student of the biochar. So yeah, I'd like to continue that conversation with people that are interested locally. So, but in case, Mark, I appreciate your presentation. You did a good job. Like I said, we're only scratching the surface, but that's a start.
Yeah, all of these things go on, and we can do part 2 sometime if there's interest, but that's about as much as we could have got out there, I think, in an hour and a half. So I think it was a good start for anybody looking at it, and I think I would be, if anybody has ideas that are better in terms of carbon management, I'm all ears. Any critiques out there, I'm always looking for improvements on this carbon story. So happy to listen as well as share.
All right.
Well, thank you. That was fabulous. Really appreciate it.
All right. So
Very welcome.
and let's stay in touch, Mark. I would really like to stay in touch with you. So
Okay, happy to.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that concludes our program, and I got to make sure that I don't lose my recording here. So I just hit the little bars there.
Yeah, you're fine.